This program is supported by a generous gift from the Debbie Wernette Charitable Fund.
Before there was Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr., there was Paul Broussard.
It's a violent story. This one stood out for the brutality of it, for the senselessness of it.
It was just horrifying, absolutely horrifying.
Being gay was illegal, effectively. The police hated us. Everybody was in fear of AIDS. Finally, somebody had to die. That could have been any one of us.
It was like a powder keg ready to explode.
It made me angry. It felt like gay people were being killed and no one cared.
I don't know what combination of elements sparked it, but the community rose up in protest.
This was a very unfortunate incident, but it wasn't the only one. I think it woke up the community at large, not only the GLBT community, but the community of Houston.
It's not just a queer that got killed. It's a whole community of people who got hurt.
I think you've got to remember what a homophobic time that the late 80s and early 90s were. You had people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson saying that AIDS is God's punishment on gays for being homosexual, that God hates gays. In Houston here in 1985, you had Louis Welch, and he was asked, how would you address the kind of crisis with AIDS? And his response was, well, the first thing we do is shoot all the queers. And Louis Welch was not some lunatic fringe person. He had been mayor of Houston for 9 years. So you had this kind of institutional homophobia where it was perfectly okay to denigrate gay people verbally.
Political groups have formed because of oppression. And Houston probably has one of the strongest political groups, the Houston GLBT Political Caucus, because of the oppression in the early days. Bars used to be raided at a regular basis. There used to be a thing called a fag file that the Houston Police Department used to carry. When bars were raided, they would take these pictures and they had a file they called a fag file. Strangely enough, they used to do that right around election time, which just got our people out to vote.
Kathy Whitmire was still mayor, Sylvester Turner was running for mayor, Bob Lanier. I mean, that was a major change. Everything had been pretty static for the 10 years that Kathy Whitmire was mayor, but Houston was growing, I mean, fast.
The Montrose area, it was famous. I had heard of the Montrose ever since I lived in San Antonio 10 years before. And even then, people always said, yeah, you gotta be careful there, it's a gay area. People like to cause trouble.
There was an odd phenomenon going on at the time where we had teenagers from the suburbs coming into Montrose and cruising down Lower Westheimer. It's the very same thing that happens in small towns all across Texas, where teenagers go down to the town square and slowly cruise around and eye each other and park and do whatever they do. But there's always someone who has to be stupid. There's always someone who has a little too much of some intoxicating substance and wants to pick a fight or peel off through the neighborhood.
You know, there had been many muggings and attacks in the neighborhood at that point, and so it was kind of normal to hear that somebody had been mugged or attacked.
A lot of armed robberies, and unfortunately a lot of them at that time weren't reported, at least to the police, because the feeling was that the police wouldn't help.
The gay community had an uneven relationship with the police department of Houston.
Montrose is not, and was not then, home to all of the gay bars in Houston, but it was the biggest concentration of them, and that was well known. And so anybody who was either curious or wanted to mess with someone in the gay community would know to come down to Montrose. There was an active community of street prostitutes, an active community of runaway and thrown away teenagers soliciting, and there were a lot of still rough edges around Montrose 25 years ago. It wasn't exactly pioneering to live there, but it was an area that had gone into decline and had not yet come back up again.
Back in the 90s and the 80s, When we walked in the neighborhood, we pretty much walked in the streets. And some of us used to carry whistles around because we knew that lurking in the bushes that there could be somebody attacking.
And unfortunately, a lot of the reason that the ongoing attacks on gay men hadn't become public was a lot of the business owners in the community didn't want that to go out. They didn't want it to impact business in any way. They may be gay men, but they're still businessmen, and they were trying to protect their business interests. It was a tense time in the community, as well as a tense time focusing outward toward city government. It was hot. It was summer. There was a feeling that the police and City Hall wasn't paying attention to dangers in the GLBT community. It was also a time of really virulent fear of HIV and AIDS, and a lot of misunderstanding about that, and fag jokes, anti-AIDS jokes on the radio regularly.
So in many ways, 91 was the center of a storm. People were fed up. And at a certain point, enough is enough.
And I think there was an expectation among a lot of gay men that you just suck it up and deal with it. But then somebody was murdered.
It happened as Houston prepared to celebrate the nation's independence.
27-year-old Paul Broussard, who was gay, was stabbed to death outside a Houston nightclub.
A crime so shocking, it exposed a level of hatred few had publicly seen before.
Paul Broussard, he was a sympathetic figure.
Here's a 27-year-old banker who graduated from Texas A&M, was an Eagle Scout, had everything going for him. Wrong place, wrong time.
Whatever happened to start the conflict there in that parking lot, target, and they're after him, and they go and they do. Ray Hill initially he was a very strong advocate.
It was in the parking lot of the old Twit offices on Dennis Street. And so I drove over there, and there was Paul's car. Paul had been transported just before I got there. And there was a detective on the scene, Wayman Allen. And so I said, Wayman, you don't have any security tape up. You're not protecting the scene. He said, Raymond, it's not a homicide. It's an assault. Anyway, this is going to be a assailant's unknown case. That's the first thing I heard after I got to the scene. And the next morning, we found out Paul had died. So finding the assailants was all more important.
The person who's now my wife and I lived just a few blocks down the same street on which Paul Broussard was murdered.
We didn't know a whole lot, and getting information was very difficult at the time.
Maybe it was a hate crime, maybe it was a robbery, maybe it was just some transient with mental health issues, all of which could have happened in our neighborhood. If this is an attack on gay men, what can we do for ourselves to protect ourselves, because we don't have faith that the city, the police, will do what they need to do appropriately to protect us.
I had been out at the same club that Paul Broussard had been out at, Heaven. I, too, had walked home that night. I was, at that time, 25, and Paul was 27. I kind of had a moment of there for the grace of God go I. I think that after the murder of Paul Broussard, a lot of people were living with post-traumatic stress disorder. There was an intense anxiety about how far from the bar did you park? Did you park on a dark street? You better not park on a dark street. Are you the only person on the street? Because if you're the only person on the street, you could be a target and they could get you really easily. Do you have your car keys in your hand ready to open your car as quickly as you can in case someone should jump out and try to attack you?
We all knew, all of us, that we were subject to the kind of violence that Paul had experienced. We lived in a world where prejudice and ignorance and hate was a much richer metal than it is now. And in 1991, it didn't strike a chord because it was Paul Broussard. It struck a chord because it could have been me to every gay man, lesbian, and certainly transgendered person who heard the story.
First reaction is fear. First reaction is incredible sadness that this guy who's in his mid-20s, who's completed a degree with A&M, who has everything to live for, who was loved by his friends, is suddenly gone. And then there was a desire to do something.
Neighborhood patrols started up after that. All kinds of neighborhood patrols. People would take turns and drive around the blocks just looking for anything suspicious, and it was organized by the communities. Neighborhood association. The police supplied communication radios and so forth. The groups had to, adhere to certain practices and report in and promise that we wouldn't try to jump out of the cars and be heroes, that we would simply use it to summon professional police help.
And there were some productive things that happened. We organized safe zones around the major bars and nightclubs, and the Guardian Angels got revitalized. We had Montrose Patrol came in, and people would be escorted to their cars. But there was also a very focused attempt to engage City Hall and engage the Houston Police Department, and to say, if this had happened in any other community, you'd be all over it. Why aren't you doing enough? Now, I'm not saying that they weren't, but the feeling was that the police department wasn't reacting appropriately, and they'd been turning a blind eye to the kind of things that had been happening in the community.
When I accepted the position at the University of Houston in January of 1991, I called up my father, and he was a little concerned. He said, first you have to worry about the criminals there. And then he said, and then you have to worry about the police there. So Houston already had a reputation of crime, of police officers being part of the problem.
So any encounter with the police had a certain tension to it. It didn't take much for us to get mad at them because of the way we perceived that we were being treated. Enough of us were already dying. And then somebody was getting killed. And the police didn't seem to really respond. Everybody suddenly became concerned about how everyone else was going to make it home. A lot of bars, I remember the Venture Inn, Mary's, they would pay your cab fare home. But also for a lot of us, certain people, there was a bit of bravado to go with walking home alone after that time. Let them come, just let them.
I also remember a friend of mine, we were driving up Montrose, and somebody, we were stopping at a red light, and somebody said, where are the bars? And I'm about ready to say it, and this friend of mine says, don't tell them, because we didn't know who they were. And it really changed your perception of what was going on in this community. And a lot has to be said about Ray Hill. The fact that Ray Hill kept going after it, he kept bringing it up, and that there was a mayor's elections going on at that time. So all of those things together, I think, helped make this thing noticeable to people.
What clicked in me was the statement, assailants unknown. That's what clicked with me, because it meant not only had someone been killed, but as far as the police were concerned, the people who did it could not be found and would get away with it.
People were getting frustrated because we didn't feel that there was much research being done on HIV and AIDS. And Houston was lagging behind on that even more than most other cities. That people were just frustrated and finally wanted to see some change.
And so I hit the media as hard as I could.
Activists hope his death will focus attention on intolerance.
Everybody across the country and in Houston understood that you have to take advantage of those kinds of tragedies in order to move the community forward, because otherwise it'd just be a horrible death with nothing good would come out of it.
And what was really unique about ACT UP and Queer Nation is how they knew how to use the media.
We kept the story alive and on the front page and headline stories. I even had national media down here. And all of this is me using every connection I have in the media and the value of a really good story. Gay bash homicide community upset. And Brian Bradley and I pitch it to Queer Nation, and they're on the streets in 3 days.
Queer Nation was a loose confederation of groups in cities all across the United States who came together to confront homophobia, to battle homophobia, and to end homophobia. Queer Nation organized a very visible response that drew 2,000 people to the streets of Montrose when we were hoping we'd get 300 or 400, and that drew gay people and straight people, all kinds of the kind of diverse community that was Houston, to say we have had enough. We cannot continue to let gay people be killed on the streets of Houston with no consequence. And people resonating on a gut level to the fact that nobody should be killed because of their sexual orientation. I think it was a basic commitment to human decency.
Now, there have been times in the past where the GLBT community in Houston has taken to the streets. When Anita Bryant came to town in her anti-gay crusade, we took over the streets of Houston. But Houston, all the communities of Houston are generally peaceful, and protests are usually peaceful as well.
You know, Houston wasn't really known as a protest city. Part of it was the heat. Part of it was that we were spread out. Part of it was that Houston was more or less built on people coming here to get jobs, not moving here because they wanted to move here for any other reason. And so a lot of us really didn't know each other. And getting people active was very difficult at that time.
But the reaction to Paul Broussard's murder was unlike what I had experienced before, because when we marched against Anita Bryant, we were angry, we were making a statement, but it was almost joyful. We were standing up for ourselves. When Paul Broussard was murdered, we were angry and frustrated and demanding action.
I think it really shook up the community, and you know, the Queer Nation and the ACT UP group started to form in Houston, which was much later than the other cities, and started becoming involved. And to see people actually protest about this and some of the other issues of inequality here in Houston was sort of well overdue.
We blocked traffic at Westheimer and Montrose and moved the story to the front page the weekend after it happened.
What had started as a peaceful protest about the death of Paul Broussard took a sort of negative turn when we took over the intersection of Montrose and Westheimer.
Yes, things happened. Protests were done, etc. But what it was in response to the violence and the senselessness of this crime, and that the fact that it occurred, the fact that it was so brutal. Who in their right mind would do this was what it was. It was a righteous indignation.
The night of the protest, when it was said everyone was going to get the word to spread, telephone trees, everything, to gather at Montrose and Westheimer about 9 o'clock, and over 1,000 of us showed up, which was an amazing number of people all at once.
I remember at first thinking, oh my God, there's so many people here. I didn't think we'd get 300 or 400 people. And then I remember thinking, oh, there's straight people here. It's not just gay and lesbians.
And I remember getting to the intersection, and we're just kind of all walking around the intersection and blocking the traffic, and the police come up and they're telling us to disperse, and the helicopters and the press are there. And all of a sudden, spontaneously, everybody sat in the middle of the intersection. We all kind of looked around like, who told us to do that? Nobody did. It was just this beautiful, spontaneous moment where everybody at the same moment just sat down like, this is our neighborhood. We're saying.
And then suddenly there were all 4 TV stations that were there, and they were broadcasting live. And it felt like we had gone from obscurity and no one caring to suddenly it was at the top of the agenda, and the pressure was on HPD to solve this murder, and it mattered.
It felt powerful, and it felt strengthening, like, yeah, this happens and we don't like it, and so there, and we're going to protest, and we're going to make sure that it doesn't quietly fade away. There's that dignity, that self-respect that comes from standing up for oneself and one's community.
at the end of 2 weeks, a young woman, student at University of Houston Central Campus, walked up to Carl Reinhardt, an openly gay language professor out here, and said, "Dr. Reinhardt, I know someone that killed that gay banker."
And once we got the information, the cops went to work on it like any other case. And I think that was probably one of the most valuable things about the whole situation, was that you had a group that was saying, we're not getting equal treatment. We want equal treatment. We want to be considered like anybody else, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with us on any pertinent points. We're citizens. We deserve this.
First of all, you had a horrific murder. You had the so-called Woodlands 10. You had the holiday, July 4th. You had a mayor's race. It was the perfect storm for the media to pick up on this. Keep in mind, you had 10 defendants. Most of them were teenagers. You had a situation in which you had 5 defendants whom we deemed less culpable that never actually touched Paul. And then you had the 5 that were actually participated in the beating, and ultimately the one individual, John Bice, who decided it was time to take out his knife and plunge it into Paul's stomach, thus ending his life.
This case could have just died. And if it wasn't for people like Ray Hill to keep bringing it up, and some of the community to keep bringing it up, it would have just not happened.
Well, if you're going to use the media to accomplish your goals, you have to break it down into sound bites that the media can actually digest. Gay bashing is a term. It conjures in most people an image of terrible things. Woodlands 10 conjures an image of wealthy, spoiled kids coming into Montrose to do bad things to poor, working class, or disadvantaged people.
It wasn't unique to the kids from the Woodlands. It wasn't about any particular community or mindset. I know there may have been a lot of rhetoric at the time about that, but this could have happened, I think, anywhere.
All these cases were pled out. So you didn't have any criminal trials like most of the other high-profile cases have. The trials were quickly settled in a plea bargain fashion, so you didn't have any court hearing. You didn't get to really see the defendants. Bice, who got the longest sentence, and deservingly so, because if he hadn't pulled out his knife, Paul would have been injured, critically injured, more likely, but he would have survived.
Horrific things happen in cities all across America, and they happen to different communities. And often, when a community rises up, there's a backlash from the broader community, from law enforcement, from the powers that be. In Houston, an amazing thing happened, which was that people came together to fix things and to do a better job. The police department instituted a really unprecedented undercover operation.
In the aftermath of the death of Paul Broussard, Houston Police Department implemented a program called Vice Versa, where they put people, undercover officers on the street who posed as gay and lesbians to sort of gauge, like, what type of response is there? Are the people being attacked? And within a week or two, one of the people had been assaulted, and there was this big realization that we hadn't been tracking hate crimes before, but there was definitely a problem with gay people in Montrose being deliberately beaten and attacked.
So it both reassured the community, but it also was a good lesson to police officers that you protect and serve everyone. I ended up teaching at the Houston Police Academy for about 5 years in their human relations program. And I actually used the videotape from a national TV show about Paul Broussard's murder as part of my curriculum.
You know, I think that the police patrols got better. They understood. And, you know, time changed things, too. You know, because of the AIDS crisis, a lot of people were forced out of the closet, which meant that more people knew gay people, which meant that more people knew that gay people were okay.
Whenever a community is truly mourning, has been attacked, has some legitimate area of concern, whether or not I can solve it immediately, as a public official, it is my responsibility, my duty, to be there and to engage.
The political impact would have been that whoever was going to be mayor, whoever was going to establish leadership in this city, would need to address the situation.
The way I describe it, in the mayor's race, there was only one issue in Houston, Texas, and that was crime. That was it.
The issues are crime.
So you had three candidates that had to grapple with an issue dealing with what we call a parolee's paradise in Houston. And one of the candidates really took it upon himself when Bob Lanier met with some of the victims. He had them over for a breakfast buffet at his River Oaks house. And he very succinctly said, if I'm elected, what can I do to help you guys? And they said, we'd like to have a staff person out of the mayor's office to address victims' rights and other public safety issues. And Bob Lanier, being a man of many, many, many words, just went, sure. He was elected, and apparently Mayor Bob Lanier had met Nancy Rodriguez, Paul's mother, during the campaign trail. And it very succinctly goes, Andy, I met Miss Rodriguez. Can you reach out to her and see what you can do to help her? Crime victims are the only unwilling participants in the criminal justice system. So it's the least you can do to have some entities within government to looking out for the victims' rights, their well-being, their due process, putting their life together again. So you saw an enormous change happening, particularly within the criminal justice system, recognizing the victims. And one of the ways that I found to move up victims' rights was through legislation. And for every piece of legislation we've done, there's usually a catalyst, and that usually means a victim.
You do need victims advocates, someone who's going to keep tabs on what's going on, especially with the more violent crimes.
One of the defendants reached out to us via his attorney and wanted to see if we would be amiable to scheduling a meeting with him, his parents, Nancy, myself, and his attorneys, because he wanted to let Nancy know how sorry he was, how remorseful he was. He wasn't asking anything in return, which was pretty remarkable. And it meant a great deal to her. It was actually one of the ones we ended up recommending and suggesting to the prosecutor that the 5 less culpable get a probation. This was the first time in Harris County that a victim actually had input into the sentencing of the defendants. It's routine now, but that kind of set the precedent.
Governing is as much art as science, and it's experience as well as instinct. You never know really which incident will take off and galvanize a community, what spark might set off violence, and what will be an appropriate and safe protest.
Individuals in the legislature who represented the Montrose area already knew who their voter base were and what they expected from them, and sort of acknowledged that by seeking their endorsement, getting them to contribute to their campaigns. So when the gays came to the legislature and said, okay, we need hate crimes, they did begin the process of trying to get something passed.
It put the focus on the fact that we need, to address what are now known as hate crimes. We need to address, without being overly politically correct, a crime is still a crime. Murder is still murder. But we need to address the situations, the underlying causes behind them.
Getting hate crimes passed meant sitting down with our members of the state legislature and begging them to beg others to build the coalition.
I think the way we acted was trying to make sure that we did a hate crimes bill.
When I agreed to sponsor the hate crime bill in the House, it took me 4 years to pass. I would not pass the bill unless there was a definition crafted for the LGBT community. If I took that definition out, I could have passed the bill the first time. There was a guy in the legislature, my colleague, Warren Chisholm. He was as far from the right of me than right could ever get. So one day I talked to him and I says, Warren, what is it about this legislation that you can't vote for? And he says, well, if you take out the language for sexual orientation, Symphonia, I vote for it today.
We felt strongly about some language that was sexual. We felt very strongly about that.
If the crime is perpetrated as a result of someone's faith, someone's sexual orientation, that is part of the crime, then there's an additional penalty attached to it.
All of the groups got together, and for 2.5 days, we hammered out with a piece of language, definition-wise, that both sides could live with. So when the time came and we were on the floor with the bill, the speaker says, there's an amendment to the bill by Representative Chisholm, and the floor is silent. And he gets up and he explains his amendment. And I stand aside and I wait. Then I look out at the audience and I said, Mr. Speaker, I'll accept the amendment. And it was just like manna from heaven dropping down in that room. And the bill was passed. And then, we lost it in the Senate because we weren't able to get it through the Senate. And I kept wondering, was there something that I could have done different? Who else could I have brought to the table with me to help that person to understand? And then I just said, God, you're just going to have to give me the ability to pass this bill and do it again.
Real serious passage of hate crime bills in many ways ended up waiting for the atrocity that happened to Matthew Shepard and James Byrd.
James Byrd was a different kind of example of why we need to have enhanced penalties. But so was Broussard. So it's the idea that enhanced penalties help a lot of different people. We didn't get everything we wanted in the two bills, but we did get at least sexual preference in the bill. We all stand as one. If we don't do that, all of us lose.
Paul Broussard's death was certainly a catalyst. It was a focal point for what was going on. It connected those of us who were already activists in new ways, and it certainly gave us an opportunity to rally and do things to support each other as community members. But you can't view it in isolation. It was a singular event, and it was a very important event, but it wasn't the only thing that was happening. But because of when and where and how it happened and who it happened to, it brought a lot of us together in new ways and became a rallying cry.
Queer Nation definitely took its share of criticism for being too obnoxious, too in your face, for creating a negative impression of gay people, but we helped advance the dialogue. And when you look at what Queer Nation was asking for 25 years later in 2016, it's our basic civil rights. Queer Nation went and protested the fact that you could not get a marriage license as a same-sex couple in 1991. In 1991, that seemed ridiculous. Well, in 2015, when the Supreme Court rules that GLBT people have the right to marry their same-sex partners, it doesn't look ridiculous, it looks prescient.
It definitely surprises me that we're battling those same issues. I don't understand it because, on the one hand, we are about equality, and particularly the city of Houston. I mean, we had a lesbian mayor.
Even when something like the death of Paul Broussard happened, it brought new people into the process, created new activists, built new relationships. But there's a peak, and then it falls away. Most of us can't sustain that passion, that activism. But I can see the finish line on this. We have come too far to take steps back.
The world has changed a lot since then. The reality is that there are less gay bars around in this city, and part of that is the success of this community. The fact that we feel more comfortable going to, other venues.
Montrose isn't a gay community anymore. For whatever benefits equal rights have, we assimilate into society, and those communities aren't quite as necessary anymore.
We still got some battles to fight in this community and in the States, and we are always under attack. I mean, even though same-sex marriage is now legal, there's still attacks to try to stop it.
You can still be fired in Texas for being gay. You can marry your same-sex partner at 11 o'clock in the morning and at 2:30 be fired from your job. So some things have changed, but not everything has changed, and the battle against homophobia that Queer Nation was waging is certainly not won.
There are always going to be people who hate people that are different than them because that's what they've been taught.
Even though it was the 90s, we still weren't that far from the 60s. 30 years can be a very short time when you have attitudes that are passed down, parent to child to grandchild to great-grandchild. We need to look at each other and understand we're being attacked by negative influences that keep us apart every day.
It was a catalyst that motivated people to change things quicker than would have happened. And I think that's the legacy of Paul Broussard. He literally, his death ignited a change in how all of our community, every community and elected officials look at someone who is gay.
You have an entire community that essentially would galvanize themselves over this murder and basically said, we're not going to take it anymore. And I don't care what you might perceive us, we're human beings and we don't deserve to be treated like this. And if someone, commits a criminal act upon us, we expect the system to work for us just like anyone else.
It taught the community the power of unity around an issue. It was those marches on the street. It was that atmosphere that this case will not pass.
I think you always remember, like Stonewall, you always remember the significant turning points, and maybe younger generations who weren't born then. Paul would be 50 now. They may forget, or they may not find the same. It's more like reading about history rather than experiencing and living through the changes of history. So the ripples get farther out.
Things don't last forever, and that's what we all have to remember. That's why they used to call it the movement and the struggle. It's the struggle because it never stops.
I think that case, when you look back at it and look at some of the changes that have occurred since then, that it was pivotal, and that after that, people who understood what needed to be done took the steps on all sides and said, let's work together, let's do what we can, and push forward for a better situation overall.